And I want you to please explain in your book what you found, why the women didn't tell their stories publicly until you asked.
Sure. So I'm writing about Jewish women who were resistors and part of underground organized resistance cells in Poland, in the Polish ghettos, and even in some camps. These are incredible stories. And as I began to investigate them, I became both interested, what is the story? What happened? But at the same time, also what happened to the story? Why did I not know this? How could I, myself from a family of Holocaust survivors who grew up in a very much a Holocaust survivor community in Montreal, and I even have a PhD in women's history, how did I not know this? How did I not know these stories? And so I did research this as I was going along, and there's a lot more about it in the book, but many of these reasons, as you say, I came across similar things. There were personal reasons for why these stories weren't told. In some cases, the women, first of all, many of the women didn't survive, but for those who did, first of all, they tried to tell their stories and they were not believed or they were not listened to. And as soon as that happened, they retreated and they repressed them. It was too difficult. Many women were accused of having fled to fight instead of taking care of their families, and they felt guilty about this. Many women were accused of having slept their way to safety. And there was kind of an underlying assumption that I heard about time and time again, this idea that the pure souls perished in the Holocaust, but people who survived, they did something. They were collaborators or they had slept or something. And they were very conscious of that and this was very upsetting to them. Many of these women also suffered from tremendous survivor's guilt. And I'm thinking, for example, one woman, Chasia Bielika, she was in Bialystok. She had witnessed, her family was brutally murdered. And she became a courier. She became a weapon smuggler, bringing ammunition and guns into the ghetto, arming them for an uprising. She started a anti-fascist league between anti-Nazi Germans and Russian partisans. She was bringing guns from the Germans to the partisans with her own hands in broad daylight. She was transporting weapons. She was organizing. She did espionage missions for the Red Army. All to say, she had an incredible war story. But she said that when she was finally ready to talk, she felt that everyone around her was really, they were much more interested in Auschwitz or in stories of the death camps. And compared to her survivor peers who had been through camps, she actually felt like she'd had it easy. She felt that she hadn't suffered as much as they had. And so she didn't have the right to tell her story. And so she kept her story close to her heart for decades. For many of these women that I write about, there's another reason, and that is that they often self-silence to help them cope. It was also a coping mechanism. The women I write about were 18, 19, 20 when they were in the underground. When the war was finished, they had their whole lives ahead of them, but they had nothing. They had no family, they had no home, they had no nationality, and they were often in a new country, and they needed, like many refugees, I think they felt they needed to start fresh in order to move on. And many of them, they're women, and they felt a strong compulsion to have children, to repopulate the Jewish people. And they also really wanted to raise kids in a healthy and happy environment. And for all these reasons, they just didn't talk about it. They just didn't talk about it. For decades, they didn't talk about it.
You had a lot of time to get to know the kids of those who survived, their descendants. What is their reaction now that their mothers, parents also, because there were some men, stories is being broadcast all over the world? What are they telling you? Because I'm sure you're like on the email with them all the time now, right?
I'm on the email with them all the time, and with many more people who started emailing me when this story went public, telling me stories of their mothers and their grandmothers and their great grandmothers that I'd never even heard of. So we're still growing. I mean, I think so far everyone who's been in touch with me has been very grateful that I am bringing these stories to light, that the stories of their mothers and grandmothers will be shared more broadly. I think some people more than others have felt very upset that no one has not celebrated, but commemorated their mother's efforts in the war. So in general, the response has been one of gratitude, which thank goodness, because I was very worried about this. But yeah, so far, so good.
So your book has 73 pages of endnotes and cited sources. I counted because I know what it's like as an author to wish I had more space for the book and less space for the footnotes. Although as an academic book, or it's a very big service that you did. Mine has 63, 8 pages, whatever, of footnotes. You called it academic paranoia that you suffered from when you were researching. And I understand exactly what you mean. Can you explain this feeling?
This is a really good question. In all my interviews, no one's asked me about this before. So thank you for asking that. There are 900 footnotes. It took me 6 weeks full time just to edit them, just to edit the language in the footnotes. It was a huge undertaking. And the footnotes are largely discursive. Some of them say where I got the information, but a lot of them explain where I got the information and explain even that there were some conflicting accounts and I've chosen this account. Or, many of them, I mean, you don't need to read the footnotes at all. You can read the whole book without reading the footnotes. I read them. I don't want to scare anyone, but they are there. If you're interested, where did she get this story? How come she's telling it from this perspective? I often explain it in the footnotes. Academic paranoia. So I am not a scholar of the Holocaust, but I'm a historian. I have both BA and MA and a PhD in fields of history. And I spent 6 years working also at a museum. I actually spent 6 years working in as a museum of living rooms in London. And I'll tell you this story because this is where I got this from. My supervisor there, I was researching, it was a lot of detective work. And I picked up a lot of skills from that kind of work because it was a museum of historical living rooms. And, what did a living room look like in 1685? There was no Instagram. Someone had to go, so we had to think around how to fill out missing stories. We had to think about sources. And so for instance, but my supervisor, I would pull up there was one main book on Regency wallpapers. And if I was looking for something, I would be like, oh, I'd write something from the book. And she went, Judy, call him. And I'd be like, call him? Call who? Call the author. Why should I call the author? She said, call him and make sure that everything he wrote in that book, that he doesn't know anything more, that he doesn't contradict it, or I'm like, but it's published in the book. She's like, no, call him anyways. And there was such a, you had to get it right. And part of that in museums is because there's financial value attached to these objects too. So there were stakes to this research, but that really, that's where I developed the paranoia, the call the author. Just because it says it on the page, there might be more work to do. And so for this book, I really, I wanted to explore every event that I wrote about and every incident from as many perspectives as I could. I wrote a history here out of memoirs and out of testimonies largely. And it was very important for me to read as widely as possible, often in different languages, and find the event from various perspectives so that I could build it up in as accurate a way as I felt possible. It was very important for me to tell the truth that I found, but also to be nuanced in that and to understand that there are different readings of situations, and that's why I have all the footnotes.
How much of that academic paranoia, though, might be because I could count on one hand the names of the women historians who write about World War II and the Holocaust: Margaret Macmillan,
yeah,
Lucy Davidovitz, Of course, Deborah Lipstadt, Hannah Arendt. Anymore? That's it. That's all I can think of off the top of my head. Where there's millions of books about, not millions, but men. It's a man's world. So being a woman author, yeah, yes, you have a PhD, but you are not part of a university teaching, writing, world. How much pushback or even imposter syndrome-ish thing did that weigh on you when you're writing this really important story?
So yes, I think you're right. Part of it is that I was absolutely trying to prove the truth of this story. Also, the scope of the story is so large. As we said, I couldn't believe I didn't know it. So if I didn't know it and I'm offering this whole new take to the Holocaust, which is a very sensitive subject, I'd better get it right. Um, and in earlier drafts, I had a lot of doubt in my writing. I wrote very often like, well, maybe this happened, or perhaps we can imagine, and well, perhaps I'm telling a thing. And my editor and readers, they were like, whoa, no, what? You don't need to be so self-deprecating. You've done more research than anyone we've ever worked with. And so they helped me take out some of that language. But it's very important for me to be nuanced and to sort of be open about where I come to my judgments.
Thank you for that. I want to switch paces a little bit about, instead of the process, and talk a bit more about the book and the Canadian angle. I know that Faye Schulman and her husband made it to Canada. Besides them, any of the others came to Canada, or are there kids in Canada, or is it mostly that's the only one you found of this of the Kashariot?
No, I found people. I mean, Faye was not a Kishari. She was she was a partisan in the forest. So I talk in the book about different types of women in the organized resistance, and I spoke to families in Canada. I spoke to families in the U.S. and I spoke to a lot of families in Israel for this project.
So there's more than just the Schulmans in Canada. Could you mention names, even though I didn't see any in the book? But
well, not everyone's story was in the book. So, but there's some in the footnotes. Yes, there were a number of Vilna partisans who are in Canada. And I did interview them and their families.
You chose, as you said, about 20 or so. I know there's hundreds more. And what are you going to do with the ones that didn't make it in? Do you have plans to write a second book or a newsletter? I don't know. What are you going to do with those stories?
I literally had this call with my editor last week, and because I didn't know this, just the book went public maybe 2-3 weeks ago. I wrote an article for the New York Times, and suddenly the floodgates opened, and I started getting all the people sending me books and photographs and stories of their family members, and we've just been talking about what to do. We were just talking about maybe for when the paperback comes out, I would add some section that just talked about this experience and these other women that have come out of the woodwork, perhaps. I'm not sure yet. I feel like I need to start a museum or an archive. I feel like someone needs to collect these stories. So watch this space. We're thinking about doing something on my website to help collect these stories, perhaps creating actually some kind of online archive for this.
On page 55, you said Renya never revealed how she exited the ghetto. Does it matter? And what do you think she did?
This is why you get academic paranoia, because feel like page 55, what did you mean? So this is a story where in the ghettos, and this wasn't just Renya, these were many times women and children who escaped from the ghettos to barter whatever objects they still had for food, or to sell them for, not even zlotys, like pennies. And men often didn't do that because they were captured, they were already killed, they were already in a labor camp, or it was too dangerous for them to be out. I mean, for women too, leaving the ghetto, you would be killed. But in this case, how do I think she slipped out? This ghetto that in that town didn't have part of it was bordered by water, part of it had it was a barbed wire border to this ghetto. There were over 400 ghettos in Poland. Poland alone, and each one was different. There was different qualities to the ghettos, to how they were run. Part of them having to do with local Nazi government, part of them having to do with local Jewish leadership, and partly to do with the landscape and what the town or the city looked like. And in this case, in Yenstochov, it was a barbed wire enclosure. So she probably found either places, what I would read about many of the women, they would either find places where they could slip through. They were tiny, they were skinny adolescent girls. Some of them climbed over roofs. These were short buildings. They weren't high-rise buildings. These were small towns. So they would climb over a roof. Sometimes there was a basement that they used, and they went underground. In this case, I don't think she did this, but many women left the ghettos by joining labor forces. Jews were sent out in forced labor units. And so a woman would join that, march out of the ghetto as part of this force. Usually she had to bribe someone to get into the marching formation and then slip off. In some ghettos, there were certain, in Warsaw ghetto, the courthouse was on the border of the ghetto. And so you could actually go in and exit the ghetto through the courthouse. There was also a street market that bordered one part of the ghetto. So depending on which ghetto, there were different ways that people came in and out. Sometimes they really did climb over a wall.
We're in a period of time where everyone is watching the George Floyd trial, where people, BIPOC, anti-Islamophobia, anti-Asian hatred, that is what is taking up space now, Black Lives Matter. How do you find space for this 80-year-old Holocaust story in a world where that's old news?
I don't think it's old news at all. I think it's really related to what we're talking about today. I think, first of all, 80 years, not that old. But I also think that, these are stories of young activists, which is what we're seeing so much of today, and young activists who are taking strong stands and who are fed up and who are furious with injustice. And this is exactly what this story of these women are. These are women who were, they had nothing. They were starving. That didn't matter. They took on the German army. The biggest armies in the world couldn't defeat the Nazis. That didn't matter to them. What mattered to them was the fight for justice, the fight for freedom, the fight for what was right. And if anything, I hope that what people take from this book is that even though their small acts mattered, they mattered to them, they mattered to the people around them, they mattered to generations later. They have meaning. Even if these women didn't topple the Nazis, their work, their daring, their courage is meaningful even to us today.
You did include in very, very short snippets and chapters, and we talked a little bit beforehand about how I should ask you this, so I'm going to just disclose to the audience. Don't ask about this, but I'm going to ask it this way. You do have some chapters about rape and about other kinds of torture, how did you decide how much to say? And tell us about this conscious decision and how to treat this material.
It's hard, I don't know that that there's a formula that, I'm going to say 7 things about that and 8 things about that. And I don't know. Some of that is just being in the moment as a writer and what you feel you need to build out the story. Every event that I mentioned was because it was mentioned in someone's testimony or someone's memoir. And sometimes as I just said, it was very important for me to share the brutality so that you understood both what the Holocaust was and what these women were up against when they went to fight.
You didn't shy away from it, but you didn't devote 10 chapters to it, but it needed to be said.
Either.
The thing is, nobody talks about this stuff in other writing. I'm a little older than you, went through the same education system. I'm not Holocaust survivors directly, but very, well read in this field. I've seen lots of military, liberations of the camps and soldiers who liberated them, and read, lots of testimony from what they saw in photos. And I had never seen or heard anything like what you said. So I had to put it down. I couldn't deal with it for a week. I couldn't look at your book, to be honest. So um, I think that is so shocking, but it needed to be said. You didn't shy away from it thinking, well, should I, shouldn't I, right? Because it happened, right? So you
Oh
did deal
yes,
with it, but you didn't dwell on it because it was shocking enough as by itself, right?
I think so. And sometimes I just didn't have more information. These are coming from, especially when you talk about sexual violence. I mean, there are tidbits everywhere, but most women, even in their very personal writings, don't talk about this. It's a very underreported subject. And so I mention whatever I could find on it, because I mean, some more recent scholarship, and there's very little of it, but felt that a majority of Jewish women experienced sexual violence in the Holocaust. And again, this was silenced for many reasons: discomfort on part of researchers, and certainly personal discomfort, and people not wanting to talk about it. So a lot of times I couldn't expound on it because these people, they were already, they no longer alive. So I'm not able to ask them more than what's in the testimonies and memoirs that they've left. But it's alluded to frequently.
What do you keep by your computer, if anything, to get you through this, dealing with this horror that you have to deal with? What's your touchstone? What's your escape?
Um, Honestly, I've never told anyone this. Dance music. I listen to really like upbeat, or often electronic music.
EDM.
Yeah, a lot of EDM, and that really has to be a background to a lot of my writing. I needed to write most of this book in around other people, even though I was working by myself. I actually joined a women's workspace here in my neighborhood. The majority of people around me work in the fashion and fitness industries, and I needed that instead of, at first I was working at Jewish libraries, which are amazing resources, but it was like almost too difficult. I needed to be in a buzzier, uplifting, this was a workspace, it was literally pink. And and it had EDM in the background. I mean, like, I needed that, that environment to balance the horrible personal stories that I mean, the people next to me, I would share a table with people who were like arguing about like the placement of cheese in an ad for Vogue. And, that was like what there was, so I needed that kind of, to feel that there was something lighter around me in order to be able to dig so deeply into this material.
Now, I know in my work, I've been able to do these matchmaking, reuniting some soldier with a billet that they stayed at 75 years ago in Holland, or a survivor's family with the soldier who saved their parents' talus, even though the grandparents had been deported to Sobibor. Long preamble, I apologize. Tell us if you have one similar experience of making this connection with people who maybe lost touch, or, didn't know through a letter that someone had been saved. If that's happened to you in this research, I'm sure there has.
I mean, it's literally happened yesterday. It turns out that my central character, Renya Kukielka, has a whole branch of family here in the US. And they didn't know that, they had no idea about this, their cousin, Renya. And they changed their names to sound more American, but one person in the family recognized the name when they saw an article I'd written, and they got in touch with me, and we played a little back and forth. Could this be related? And at first I was like, no, there's no. And then I was like, oh yeah. Then I spoke to her brother, Aaron, and they were like, Aaron? That was the brother? We met him in Israel 70. And I was like, yes. So this woman in this book, that's your cousin. And they had no idea that the family even existed. And they certainly didn't know that she was an underground operative in the war. So now I'm making matches between the families and connecting them.
That's the best fit. That's another book, I should tell you, is the closure you're giving to people, or the discovery. You mentioned that you feel that you are the granddaughter of some of these women, like Frumka, who didn't survive. And I would like to know more about this feeling of burden / responsibility and duty.
Yes. I always say this was a labor of love and of duty. Um, Frumka did not survive. She was, I mean, she was a leader of the Jewish or a community before the war. She was 25 when war hit. She fled east, as did everyone, but she couldn't. She was safe, but she couldn't take it. She insisted on going back. She smuggled herself back into Nazi-occupied Poland. She went to Warsaw. She became a leader in the Warsaw Ghetto, traveled through the country, connected communities, gave lectures, brought underground bulletins, ran soup kitchens, became the first person to smuggle guns into the Warsaw Ghetto in a bag of potatoes, was sent to Beijing, this town. She became the head of the resistance there, organized the resistance, ran the underground, negotiated with Polish leaders, with Nazis, with Jewish leaders, and went down fighting with a gun in her hand, shooting at Nazis who were trying to kill her. And she was even awarded a medal by the Polish government for military service after the war. And yet I'd never heard of her. And I don't think anyone I know had heard of her. And so I think I've felt, in certain people like Frumka, she never had a granddaughter. Look, it makes me like, I get emotional just talking about it, because I feel a great duty to tell her story. She was a leader of the Jewish people in the war, and we've completely forgot. They used to call her Die Mame, the mother. I mean, she was a real figure in the community. And so I feel like I, in some ways am a granddaughter she couldn't have or didn't have. And now that I know this story, it is my duty to tell it.
You said, I've read, you didn't always know that diary was going to be a book. And in fact, you weren't planning on it being a book.
I found this Yiddish book. I can't remember. I'm not sure if I shared it with you already. Okay. I'm doing so many events these days. I'll tell you the story.
Do you have it there with you? I want to see it.
Yeah, I do. You're
Show
also
it,
the
show it,
first
show it.
person to ask. You see, we historians with our academic paranoias. All right. Looks like yours. I found this book by accident 14 years ago in the British Library. I was writing about strong Jewish women, and I won't tell the long version of the story, but basically I called up some books and then I was looking for, and suddenly I find this book. It's like falling apart, the copy that I have. But I start flipping through it, and it's in Yiddish. It's called Frauen in die Ghettos, Women in the Ghettos. And obviously it's an old book. And I happen to speak Yiddish. My Montreal Jewish education and family taught me well. So I start flipping through this book. I mean, my Yiddish was rusty.
I only know swear words. It's okay.
Wow,
I got kicked out of Yiddish class. It's all right.
And so look here, this book, maybe you can see, there's photographs and snippets and names of all these young Jewish women who fought the Nazis. And the chapter titles, sometimes it's names, sometimes it's ammunition, guns, combat. What is this? I'd never seen anything like this. I had to flip through it a few times because, like, am I getting it wrong? Is my Yiddish so rusty that I don't even know what I'm talking about? But no, this book was the beginning of everything for me. And it was a story about these young Jewish women and their defiance in the war. And it was published in 1946. So immediately I knew this was unusual. There was something here that was so different. And I spoke to a couple of people I know in the Yiddish world, and they suggested I apply for a translation grant. And so I applied to translate it. And I got a grant from the Hadassah Brandeis Institute in Boston. And I thought it would take a few months, Anyways, that translation took like 5 years for me to do. Partly it was difficult. It was a difficult translation project, and partly emotionally, I wasn't ready. As we talked about, this is such difficult work. I wasn't really ready to go there except for an hour or two here or there. I really had to buffer it emotionally. So 5 years later, I hand them this translation. I think they thought I was a lost cause already. And they said, they agreed. They always were supportive of the project. This is very interesting. So we talked a lot about how I could publish the translation as an academic resource for other Holocaust scholars. And that went through a few different versions. And then we were thinking of doing an annotated translation with working with other scholars. But in the meantime, I'm a writer. I left my history background and I started doing more creative writing and journalistic writing and writing books. And I started writing it as a novel. And I started doing it as fiction. And I actually combined my grandmother with one of the other characters and was coming up with a more. But again, I sat on this for a long time. And then eventually it was 2017 and the women's marches had just started happening around the world. And then I got a moment of, oh, maybe this is a good time for this story. I think people are interested once again in feminism, in strong female heroes, in female resistance. And so I happened to mention this like in passing to my literary agent at a breakfast. I was like, oh, I found this book. I'm going to do an academic thing and then I'm going to write a novel. And she was like, wait a minute, Judy, wait a minute. This happened? And I said, yeah. She said, Jewish women were walking around with guns taped to their torsos and shooting Nazis. And I said, yes, these are the stories I've been finding. And she said, no, you have to write this as a nonfiction book. This is very important to tell as a true story.
Thank you so much for the work that you have done.
And thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.